All right, we are at the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and kick things off. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Bob Cohn. I will be our moderator for today's webinar, ready for revolutionary storage management, StorCycle. You know, I've heard it said that new solutions create new challenges or new problems. I've also heard that described as evolution. And there's certainly been quite a bit of evolution in the storage industry. If you look back over the last few years with solid state and flash having such a new role in primary storage, cloud storage making the scene. And if I look at some of the advantages of these new solutions, they're quite frankly overwhelming. There's so many new things we can do and new ways we can do it. If I look at the challenge that it sometimes creates is that in many aspects we're creating new storage silos. And so if we look at the evolution of storage and we want to apply something revolutionary to it, I think it would be some way to break down those silos to make it easier to see what we have, where we have it, and how we manage it. And that is what StorCycle is all about, and that's what we want to share with you today. So we are fortunate to have Spectra's very own Jeff Bronstein, who is the Director of Product Management. Jeff, are you with us?
I am, yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear. So we're going to ask Jeff to walk us through StorCycle. So Jeff, I will let you take it away.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Bob. I'm really excited to be able to talk to everybody about this new product. We've announced it last week, and we expect it currently to be available to our customers at the end of November. So why did we build this product? Well, this is what we're seeing with a lot of our customers and organizations we're working with. A lot of these organizations have large amounts of data. It's critical to their business, and it's growing rapidly. But typically, they're keeping all of this data, both active and inactive data, on the same expensive primary or production tier of storage. It turns out, though, that for most organizations, 80% of that data is inactive. It doesn't need to be on that expensive active storage system, and therefore it's on the wrong tier of storage, costing that organization a lot of money. The data is growing fast. Also, they need an easier way to share the data. So these organizations have to change to survive, right? You can't leave all the data on the primary storage. The cost will simply overwhelm you over time. And, you know, there is secondary storage out there, the long-term storage like Spectra makes, including tape and disk, we'll talk about in a bit. But just buying that alone isn't enough. Organizations need to have a complete plan, as Bob said, for seeing all and managing all of their data. Now, there are some good systems out there that do this, but generally what we've seen is that they're expensive. So this graph is not based on any specific data. It's just sort of observational, anecdotal data seen by Spectra in the field. The blue parts of the bar represent the dollars per terabyte of hardware storage, and the orange represents the software, the data management, the cost to get it there. You can see that, and we all know, just, you know, we all know in the IT world that the cost of hardware for storage has been dropping over time and continues to do so. We've not seen that same trend in the data management software, and so we're now at a point where the software actually costs more often on a dollars per terabyte basis than the hardware itself, and it ends up becoming more of a cost multiplier for organizations. And this is becoming a barrier for organizations to be able to successfully implement a complete data management and secondary storage solution. And so they just continue to buy more primary or production storage rather than implement something like this. We at Spectra wanted to do something about this. So imagine having all your data always in the right place. No matter where it is, it's easily accessible and securely stored. What we envision is a two-tier model. Now, we weren't the first to come up with this type of model. The high-performance computing industry has been thinking in this way for a while now. But I believe we were the first to name it the perpetual tier. We like that name for that secondary tier. So that you've got your primary tier in the middle of the sphere, if you will, that can consist of your fast storage, whether it's solid-state flash or high-performance hard drives. And then this perpetual tier of data for your less active data. That could include object storage, disk, could include tape, could include the cloud. But the idea is we want to make those two tiers seamlessly connected and have a solution that can do that. By moving more of this of the inactive data to this perpetual tier, we can potentially speed up our primary tier of storage or maybe migrate to a newer technology. Maybe you want to move to the latest, NVMe primary storage tier. You couldn't do that before because you had too much data on primary tier. It would have been too expensive. But now that you've, reduced all that, gotten all that inactive data off the primary tier, now you can potentially afford a more expensive solution. We can almost essentially provide limitless storage capacity in the sense that some of the storage on the perpetual tier is so low, like an extra tape copy, for example, can be less than a penny per gigabyte, that to users it's seemingly limitless. We can also use that perpetual tier of storage to work with the cloud for easy use of cloud workflows. And of course, it's all driven by major cost savings, getting all that inactive data off of your expensive tier of storage and moving it to a lower cost perpetual tier. Now the two-tier model doesn't, we represent that as kind of being a solid tier, but within the perpetual tier, you can also sort of have sub-tiering, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So this is what StorCycle does. It addresses these things. So the first thing it's going to be able to do is automatically identify inactive data on a primary storage system, right? So it's going to scan that. And we've got a couple different methods or workflows for how the data can be identified and moved that we'll talk about more in a minute. Of course, the second thing it does that's important is then once it identifies what data is inactive, it's going to move it to the target or targets that you choose within StorCycle based on the policies you set. And again, that could include disk, cloud, tape, anything in that perpetual tier of storage. Then we're going to protect it and ensure that it's safe for the long term. That could include protection in the sense that you may make 2 copies of the data in 2 different geographic locations so that if a disaster occurs at one site, you've still got a copy of the data at the other site. And remember, I should mention that, again, you're moving mostly your inactive data with StorCycle. Your active or primary tier of storage, it's still critical that you continue whatever backup processes you have on that, but you're of course going to now reduce your backup costs because you've got a smaller amount of data that you're backing up. In the perpetual tier, you don't have that concept of backups, so what you need to do is make ideally multiple copies of your data and ideally in different locations for best protection. We can also make ejected copies on tape, for example, for the best protection from ransomware and other type of malware. And then we can also do seamless migration to newer technology. So we can move to newer tape generations, newer disk or NAS storage in the background transparently without disrupting users. And of course, it's all for naught if the users can't get their data back. And we've got a few different methods that users can retrieve or access their data, and we'll show you what that looks like. In terms of what does it look like kind of visually, what does the solution look like? Well, of course, as I mentioned, we've got this primary tier of storage. It could consist of 1 or more storage sources, physical storage locations. It can be, all different types of primary storage, Windows, Isilon, NetApp, anything that we can connect to. And then StorCycle is going to connect to that on a server. Now, StorCycle is just software. In fact, Spectra does not even offer a server for the product. This is something that the organization or the customer provides themselves. Now, we looked around, we talked to a lot of customers that needed a solution like this, and the vast majority of them used Active Directory, both for user authentication as well as file permissions. And so for the first release, what we've decided to do is have StorCycle run on Windows so that we have the best native integration with Active Directory. Now we're also developing a Linux version in parallel. It's already up and running, and we'll have that in the second release as well, and that will support Linux environments and LDAP and that type of thing. But basically, this Windows server is going to be running, and anything that StorCycle can mount as a file path from Windows, CIFS, NFS, direct attached storage, whatever it is, anything we can access as a file, we can scan it and we can migrate that data from that primary storage tier. Then StorCycle, of course, is going to migrate that data to this perpetual storage tier. And the perpetual storage tier can consist of 3 major types of storage. The first is NAS, and that could be, for example, Spectra Logic's Black Pearl NAS. We've got an excellent long-term NAS storage solution for bulk storage, for secondary storage with very affordable costs. That's highly reliable. But we can also, of course, connect to any other NAS or, again, any file path, essentially, that we can access from that Windows server. We can also attach to the cloud and migrate data to the cloud. For the first release, we'll support Amazon or anything that looks like Amazon. That could include Wasabi, for example, Cloudian, and others that nearly perfectly emulate that Amazon interface. In a future releases, of course, we'll add other cloud services like Azure and Google. And then, of course, our Black Pearl converged storage system. Black Pearl is an object storage gateway that acts as a gateway to some of our other long-term storage targets, which includes all of our Spectra tape libraries, as well as our Black Pearl object storage disk. So based on policies, we can move data to one or more of the targets behind Black Pearl. So with the combination of these three storage targets, Black Pearl, NAS, and public cloud, you can set up policies to migrate data to one or more of these storage locations. So for example, you might migrate data, one copy to NAS and one copy to cloud. That way you have two copies for protection.
Hey Jeff, Bob here, I want to jump in and ask a question. As we look at this picture, if there's so many different use cases this could go into. We're talking a lot about migrating and based on age and things of that nature. If someone just wanted a simple way to move something off of their primary storage tier into the cloud, and maybe it's not even a continuous monitoring thing, is that something that StorCycle could be used for, or does it really just lend itself more to this, constant monitoring and movement?
Yeah, so the movements you'll see, and we'll cover a bit more in detail in the next slides. That's a great question. But you can do one-time movements or recurring movements. You can also do copies instead of movements. So maybe you want to make a disaster recovery copy of some data, but you want to keep working with it on that primary storage tier. Maybe you've got some camera footage you've just shot and you're going to be editing it, but you want to make a protective copy before you work with it. StorCycle is excellent for that as well. Yeah, great question.
Okay, great, thanks.
In terms of accessing StorCycle, I should mention here that there's nothing else installed for StorCycle. Once StorCycle is running on this server, there's nothing to install on any of the storage locations. There's also nothing for users to install. Users can continue to go to the same location and access path to get to the data where it was before, or they can access the web interface of StorCycle. This web interface serves two purposes. First is for administrators. They can go and configure and monitor the system as you would expect from any traditional IT system. But over in the left navigation, folks that we call storage managers can also do regular scan, migrate, and restore operations. And we'll talk a little bit more, and you'll actually see a demo of that. Now there's two ways that we can migrate data in StorCycle, two ways of thinking about data and how it's grouped and how it's moved. The first we think is somewhat unique, and we haven't seen a strong focus on this, and we call this migrating project directories or project archiving. So I've got a set of data, maybe I am a researcher and I've got some weather data or something like that, or some group of data, and it's often machine generated as well, right? So genomic sequencers, microscope output, weather instruments, autonomous vehicles, and in the media and entertainment space it might be a TV episode or some footage you've shot. But we think of this data as a group or as a project, and essentially it's all going to live in a directory, of course, for practical terms. We may work with it for a while, and then when we're done, we want to migrate it into this perpetual tier. We want to archive it. So we will do is we'll set policies to move it, which targets we want to send it to. We might add metadata tags. That's something that StorCycle supports, so that we can easily find it and search for it later based on those tags. But this is a one-time event. It's a user saying, I want to archive this project. I want to archive everything in the directory. I want to do it once, and I'll probably come back and do some other projects, similar projects in a similar way, migrate them in a similar way in the future. Now the other method is, besides migrating project directories, the other method is something that we think of as being more traditional for data management solutions, and that's the auto migration feature. So this is where you allow StorCycle to scan and look for data that has passed a certain age. When we say age, it could be the last access date of the file, and that's the default, as you would expect. When was the file last used? That's probably most important. You could also change age, though, to mean the last modified date or even the created date of the file. That's set in a global setting in StorCycle. You can also add filters based on the size of the file. So what we find is oftentimes people have a lot of small files, They're slow to transfer typically. They often have extra costs on some of the storage targets, like in the cloud. There's often per object fees, so you're paying fees based on every file or object you upload. And then at bottom line, by the time you've moved all those small files, you may not have freed up much space anyways. So there's a lot of focus on age and size when choosing what data to migrate. Then what you'll do is you'll just set up a recurring policy. So maybe I'm a IT administrator, I manage, my organization's large set of data. I don't know anything about projects. I just want StorCycle to scan, find the old data, move it off, and I want StorCycle to do that, once a month or once a quarter or something like that. But again, it's really more of the set it and forget it type option of continuously. Now, we're not continuously scanning the source storage. We run it once, it's scheduled, and then we do it again on some, recurring basis. Now, when we take the file off of the primary storage, there's a number of actions we can take to make the file still accessible. So let's talk about that. The first is we can leave something behind in the place of the file. So when we take the file off the primary storage, we can put something in its place. The first thing that we can put in the place of the file is called an HTML link. Again, we think this is something unique. We haven't seen other people do this. We think this is something new and special in StorCycle. I'll talk about that more on the next two slides. The second is we can replace the file with what's called a symbolic link. As many of you may know, a symbolic link is supported on all major operating and file systems. And essentially what it is it's a pointer to another file. So to any user or application, it appears that the file is still there. In fact, if you go to Windows Explorer or Mac Finder, you'll see that the file's still listed. But it's not there. It's a link pointing to another file on one of the storage targets. For example, it could be Spectra's Black Pearl NAS. So if an application tries to access the file, it still pulls it up, but it pulls it from the storage target. So it will be slightly slower, but still you get that essentially immediate access. And that works well with storage targets that have data like disk, like NAS targets, where the data is immediately accessible. The third option would be to not move the file at all. Now, as Bob asked earlier, we do that well. We can make copies of files, as I mentioned, like for disaster recovery. My example there was, I've got some video footage I've shot, and I want to immediately go back and make an extra copy. We can do that as well. And the fourth option in terms of replacement would be just remove the file completely. Don't leave anything in its place. And if the user wants to get the file back, they can go to the web interface of StorCycle and use the search tool, which you'll see in a bit.
So Jeff, Bob again, do you feel like this aspect of being able to remove the file and leave nothing in its place, is that more a function that you would see with the project archive that you were talking about a little bit earlier?
It could be either one. It really depends on the organization and the sophistication level of the organization. We've talked to some like research organizations where they have some pretty savvy users, even the users of the data. And so asking them to go to a web interface is no big deal. And they know that if they can't find their file, they can go to the search tool. Other users, they have environments where they're not very tolerant to changes. And so they might have to have something in place like HTML links or symbolic links where the user always will be guided on what to do, right? So it really just depends on the environment in which we're installing StorCycle.
Gotcha.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit more about this HTML link option. So what we're trying to address with HTML links is having storage targets that have a longer restore time, right? That asynchronous restore where it might take minutes or hours for a file to come back. Examples include Amazon Glacier or Deep Archive or tape, right? So Spectra makes tape libraries. That's the most affordable and reliable speedy storage medium you can get on the planet. But it does take a few minutes sometimes to get the files back. And you can't expect users to click on a file and to wait minutes or hours for that file to load, right? So we need to have a more realistic experience for the user and set their expectations properly that the restore could take some time. You still definitely want to do that, right? Because the driving force of tape and Amazon on Deep Archive, of course, is cost, and for tape especially, it's reliability. So you definitely want to be able to take advantage of those, but then you still need to be able to have a way that users can easily interact with those longer restore time type storage locations. So what we do is, if you see over there on the left, I've got a directory full of files. I archive them. I take those files away. I put them on, let's say, Amazon Glacier, and then I replace those files with new files, and the new files have the same name, but with a .html extension. Those files sort of serve two purposes. The first is that the user sees, oh, there used to be a file here with this name. It sort of acts as like a breadcrumb, if you will. But when you double click on that HTML file and open it, it tells you more about the file. It says, hey, this file's been archived. Here's when it was archived. Here's where it was archived to. And if you want to restore the file, you can click on these buttons. And the buttons will launch the web interface of StorCycle and walk you through the restoration process. The first button is sort of like Amazon's one click to buy now, where it does everything in default settings. It just restores that one file back to its original location. The second button gives you a little more flexibility. You know, maybe you want to restore not just that one file, but also other files around it, or maybe you want to restore the whole project. And maybe you want to restore the files to a different location other than from where they were originally located. You can do all that with these options. But again, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say, so this HTML link, and when you first started out, you said this was one of the things truly unique about StorCycle, is one of the challenges that I know historic HSMs, hierarchical server management software applications, have had, and even one of the challenges that these more modern storage management software packages have had is moving information to that lower response tier of storage like tape or even cloud. So when I look at this, it's easy to think of tape, but would you use something like this if you have archived information to a low response cloud layer? Would something like this come into play as well there?
Yeah, absolutely. They work very well for both. Again, it's that idea of the delay, and a common workflow might be, I've got some research, maybe I've got an autonomous vehicle data set I've run. I've done some analysis previously on it, but I archived it because I was done with it. Then I think, oh, I want to look at it in a new way. I'm going to process that data again, and I want to work on that tomorrow. So tonight before I leave, I'm going to do the restore, this restore process. Maybe I've had it archived in the cloud. It's going to bring it back, and tomorrow when I get back into the office, it'll be there ready to work on. So yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
And again, this is all also permission based. So if I don't have permissions in StorCycle to do archive and restoring, then I wouldn't be able to do this, and I would instead be guided to a form where I can request the restore takes place, and then that request goes to an administrator to be approved or denied. So there is some control over that. But again, we like this solution better than, as Bob mentioned, like with HSMs, oftentimes they use stub files, which work well for some people, but this is essentially, again, where you're kind of tricking an application into thinking the file is there, and then in the background you're slowly trickling the files in. But you could trigger, if you grab the wrong files or too many files, you could trigger a whole bunch of tape restores or expensive cloud restores that you didn't want to do. Whereas if you're going through the actual application here, you've got more control over what's being restored and what users are doing that restores and making sure they have permissions to do so. So in addition to being able to go to the original location, right, in the file path and finding the symbolic links or HTML links to access the files, you can also go into the web interface and you can search by a few different things. One is the name of the project. So again, especially with that project-based archiving, when you archive a project, you're going to give it a name, so you can search by that. You can, of course, search by the name of the file or directories that you've archived. And then you can also search by tags that you may have used in the past. So here it is right here. You can see I may have put some metadata tags on it, like, it's experiment number 127 or whatever, and I can search for that and find the files that way as well. But again, that's, if I have permissions to do so in the system. Let's talk about a couple use case studies, and then we'll take a look at the product itself. So this is kind of the corporate IT department, and this is actually something pretty similar to what we at Spectra are doing in our own IT organization with StorCycle. So this is, again, kind of this case where I want StorCycle to be connected to my primary storage. I want it to scan and find that inactive data, take the inactive data off, migrate it to this perpetual tier. In this case, in this example, we're using NAS and we're using tape behind the Black Pearl storage system. This is going to reduce all that space on the primary storage system, freeing up more space, preventing me from having to buy more Isilon nodes or NetApp nodes or whatever. I'm also going to reduce my backup window and costs, so I'll reduce the amount of time it takes for my backups to run because there's less data to backup. Also, in the event of a disaster and I need to restore those backups, again, it's going to go faster because I've got less data to restore. We can also then give the users essentially the feel of a limitless storage capacity on their system. We can continue to migrate that inactive data and giving them lots of space on the primary storage. Now, this perpetual tier, this secondary tier we've talked about, isn't just for StorCycle. In this example here, you can see that we are using it also for the backups. So we've got a backup software application, could be Veeam, NetBackup, Commvault, any of those folks that can back up the primary tier of storage. In this example, they're moving those backups to tape. And then we've got that tape library partitioned where the backup software is using half of it and the other half is being used by StorCycle. So taking advantage of that perpetual tier of storage for multiple applications. This other use case study, this is loosely based on a customer that we've got that's helping us beta test the product. They're a biomedical research institute, and they've got these devices that are generating data. One of them, for example, is a cryogenic microscope, video microscope. Another is a gene sequencer. And on these machines, they've actually got storage right on the devices themselves. And so StorCycle will be mounting those devices directly and migrating the data off of them. They also have, kind of a core primary storage system and are, putting data on there to do processing with, supercomputers or whatever. And when they're done with that, they'll be using StorCycle to migrate the data off. But again, this is replacing a hierarchical storage manager system that they've got that's complex and to manage and expensive. They really like the concept of project-based archiving in these types of environments, again, especially with that machine-generated data we talk about. In terms of storage targets, they really like tape, of course, due to its high reliability and low cost, because oftentimes, they're storing data for years and years. They also like the cloud for sharing data. They don't necessarily want to keep it there forever due to the expense of the cloud, but they do want to use it to be able to share data. So they do a research project, they publish a paper, and then they also want to publish the data that was used to generate that research paper, to share it with everybody so people maybe want to verify the results or something. Another use case study is for the media and entertainment industry. A lot of organizations in this industry do have what we call media asset management solutions, or MAMs, where they're managing their video assets. And a lot of those solutions do have integrations to be able to archive data. And in fact, our Black Pearl converged storage system has a lot of certified integrations with a lot of those MAM solutions. And so for some organizations, that's all they need is they've got their MAM, they've got their assets, and they use the integrated archiving options in that software. But for some organizations, they've got a set of data outside of that normal pool of data that's not being managed by the MAM. Maybe it's creative assets or something else that's not being used by the MAM or not being managed by the MAM. In that case, StorCycle is a good option for them. Other organizations within the media and entertainment space, like post-production, they often don't use media asset management solutions, and what they do is when they work with, they again work on sort of the mindset of projects, and they have a fairly complex directory structure, tree structure based on all their projects and seasons and episodes and that type of thing. And for that kind of environment, StorCycle is a really good model with the project-based archiving. And then, of course, StorCycle is good at making extra copies of data as well. It's not a true backup solution. Obviously, we're not taking snapshots and things like that, like the other backup products do. But for occasionally changing data or a set of data that's fixed, but that you want to make an extra copy of, StorCycle is very good for that. Let me go into a demo and show you just a quick glance of what StorCycle looks like. So I've got StorCycle running on my local machine. You can see I've got it running here. I've got a Windows 10 computer and it works fine on that, so it's great for demos. On the dashboard, you're going to have some information about the data that was migrated. Now, I've only got one storage source location, so it's not the most exciting graph, but you can see it tells you about how much data that's moved, and you can look at it by storage location and by department. It also shows cost savings. So when you tell us about a storage location in StorCycle, you tell us the cost of that location, both the source, maybe your source data is $1,000 a terabyte, and your target location is, $75 a terabyte. Then you tell StorCycle those values, and then it calculates, the math and the cost savings based on the amount of data you've migrated. There's a lot of also information about jobs that are going on and the performance and other just general data and status on the system. In the upper right corner, we have this gear icon, and this is where IT administrators would go to configure the system. So setting up users, departments, storage, all those types of things, kind of more of the one-time events, right? And then, of course, you might go here to monitor the system as well. Now, the other type of user I mentioned is called a storage manager, and that's an optional user that's basically just focused on doing migration and restoring of data. They wouldn't see this gear, but they would see the left navigation over here, and that's where they would be working from day to day. Now, what we'll do first is we'll do a scan of some data set. Excuse me. What we're going to do for our primary or source storage is actually use some local data here I have on my C drive. So I have just a directory here, StorCycle source, and I've got a research project called Research Project 20. It's just got a handful of files so that I can show you how the product works. We're going to scan and then archive the data in Research Project 20. So first what I'll do is I'll do a scan, and I'll do a new scan. I select a source. I called it source 1, very creative. And we're going to go to Research Project 20. I selected that. This is a real-time browser of the data the directory. I'll go ahead, and that's the directory I want to scan, so I'll click Next. Now I can schedule the scan. Do I want to do it now? Do I want to do it at a set time? Maybe I want it to run on Saturday night when nobody's using the system. Or I can have a scan run on a recurring basis. Maybe I want to scan a share and see how we're doing in terms of, the age and size of data, and I want that to run once a month and see the results. You can do that as well. We'll just do a one-time scan right now. I'll click on Submit, and we'll see it's just a small handful of data stored locally, so it's already completed. And I used a little tool. There's a little Windows application you can do to change the age of file. So I did that so I'd have a little bit of data in every pool. You can see on the x-axis, I'm showing the age of the data from 0 to 30 days all the way up to 7 years. And then on the y-axis is the size of the data. How big is it? And then there's a further breakdown of each file, like how many files are 0 to 1 megabytes, how many files are greater than 1 megabyte, etc. So we get that nice color graph. We also get some overall data that there was 29 files and they total 8.4 megabytes in size. Now I didn't have to run that scan before I migrated the data, but I wanted to do it just to see what it looked like. Next, we'll go ahead and actually migrate the data. Where I want to migrate it to is a Black Pearl system. So if we go back to our diagram here, you'll remember that Black Pearl, it can be one of the storage targets for our for StorCycle. And what I'll do is I want to move the data to tape. So in Black Pearl, what the containers for data, the top level containers are called buckets. It's similar to the cloud. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term. In Black Pearl, when you create a bucket, though, you set a data placement policy on that bucket. So I'm going to give you this tool allows us to browse the Black Pearl. It's called the Eon browser. It's free on our developer website. And I've got a bucket on this Black Pearl system here. This Black Pearl is called BP5. I've got a bucket called Jeff Neo Test 3. Neo was our internal code name for StorCycle. And so I'm going to migrate data into this bucket. Now I know, and I can go into the web interface of the Black Pearl to see it if I want, but the data placement policy on this bucket is that when data goes into this bucket, we make one copy of the data on tape. So that's what we'll be doing. So we're going to migrate data from my primary storage, my C drive data, into this Black Pearl bucket. So now I'll do a migrate job, set up a project. I'm going to call this project 20. because that was the name of my research project. And again, remember, this name is important because I can use this name to search for this data later. I can then specify the source of the data, and then from that source, I can either do the top level directory, or we know we want to do research project 20, so we'll do that. We'll select next. Now, at the top of the next graph, the next wizard page, it asks me, do I want to use the last scan, because I remember I just ran a scan, or I can do a new one. Now, obviously, I can be more resource efficient by using the last scan, so I'll go ahead and do that. In this case, that works. Now, in this example, I'm showing you, I'm doing the project-based archive, right, where we're going to archive everything in this directory. But if I was using the other option, the auto archive option, where I want StorCycle to figure out what to archive, I could set some age and size filters. So I might say, you know what, let's only archive things that are more than 2 years old and greater than a megabyte in size. And you can see that my graph is dynamically changing here, and it's telling me, oh, okay, now you're going to archive 2 of the 8.4 megabytes. And so I could run this job every month or something like that and have it clean up all the files that meet that criteria and migrate them out of this directory. But in this case, I want to migrate everything, so I'm going to say all ages and all sizes, so I'll leave the default. You can also specify that you only want certain types of files, you know, the file extension, and you can also exclude certain directories. So that was feedback we got from users of what they wanted to be able to do with these. Next, we figure out where we want to send the data to. What is the target? Well, we talked about that already, right? We want to move data to that bucket in Black Pearl, and it turns out that I've already set that up. That is a location called BP5, and it's pointing to that bucket that I showed you. Now, I could add a second or even a third, excuse me, copy of the data here to other targets for better protection, but for our demo, we'll just send it to one location. I can then also specify what do I want to do when I take the files off the archive. Do I want to just leave them there? Do I want to remove them, or do I want to remove them and put HTML links in their place? And then, of course, in our second release, the symbolic link option will be here as well. I can then also add tags. You know, maybe it's like I've just done before in previous demos. Maybe it's Grant 234, and I want to be able to search for that tag later and find the files using that tag. And then finally, again, scheduling. Do I want to run it right now? Do I want to run it at some time in the future? Or do I want to do that recurring schedule? And again, that's something you would use if you're doing more of the auto migration, letting StorCycle figure out what to archive for you. But again, we'll choose Start Now so that we're archiving a project, and we'll click Submit. Now, hopefully, if everything goes well here, we'll click on Refresh in this bucket view. And yep, sure enough, the data is already being migrated to the Black Pearl, and in fact I bet all the data is actually there. You can see we keep the full directory structure, so if StorCycle were to go away and no longer become an available product, or you know, whatever, you stopped using it, you could still access the data by going into this tool. So I can go to see all the data here, see the structure, and I can access the file here. But you can see the files have already been moved and migrated to this Black Pearl. And the way Black Pearl works is the data first lands on its disk cache and then is later migrated to tape based on policies. And that should happen in the next minute or two. We won't wait around for that, though. What we'll do is I'll show you what happens once that is complete. So once the data is safely written to tape, then Black Pearl and StorCycle consider the transfer job to be quote-unquote complete. And once it's complete, then it knows the data is safe, and it can take the files off of the source and replace them with those HTML links. So for example, if I go here, this is a project I did previously. You can see here's one of the HTML links, and if I open a new tab in a browser, I can drag and open that. And you can see, just like I showed you in the screenshot earlier, it tells me information about that the file and how it's been archived. I could press these buttons and start the restore process, which would launch StorCycle. So that's one way that I can restore the files, is via that HTML link. The other method would be to click over here on search, or use restore over here on the left navigation. And as you saw, I can search by looking for the name of the project. I can search by file or directory names, and I can search by tag. Once I've found what I'm looking for, I can pick the file or files I want to restore, or again, restore the whole project in some cases, right? It just depends on in what way I've archived the data. So that's it for the demo. I wanted to keep that brief. A couple other things to mention on StorCycle. Let me get back to the demo page. As I mentioned, StorCycle is expected to be generally available at the end of November. Of course, when you launch a product, like any project, there's a million features you'd love to add to it, but you also have to, bring it to the world at some point. So we've released the products with the feature sets we think are important to customers. We've got our engineers head down on the product, and they will continue to work even once the first release of the product is available. We've committed all the same resources. So some of the this is kind of an estimate of the releases we're going to have. This will probably be about every 6 months or so. So in the second release are some critical things we want to include, and I won't mention all of these, but just highlight a couple. Of course, we talked about symbolic links, user access control, being able to specify what users can see and restore what files. Initially, we'll probably be doing that based on giving users permission based on storage location. I mentioned Linux and LDAP. That's a critical thing to being able to archive and restore off of Linux mounts and storage and base storage, and being able to especially get off the ACLs or file permissions, based on the authentication or LDAP mechanism that the organization's used. We want to be able to have multiple versions of files archived. This can help us, if we archive a file or make a copy of it and then somebody changes that file, then we can archive that next copy as well, and we can have multiple versions. We actually support versioning already in Black Pearl in the cloud, but we need to add it to NAS as well. Other important features that I'll mention, one is making an API exposed for use. So the web interface of StorCycle calls the StorCycle server via an API interface. We're going to be exposing some of those calls so that users, customers, organizations can make those calls themselves, so that you could programmatically scan, archive, restore, see reports and data and analytics, and figure out what's going on with your system, and also being able to automate things. Maybe you've got some custom script, or something where you're looking at files and you want to be able to integrate some of the functionality of StorCycle with something you've built. Clustering is an important part of the product. We're doing some interesting testing right now. We're finding that the faster hardware we put on StorCycle, the faster it seems to go. We were doing testing the other day. We added 128 gigs of RAM to a server, and we were getting about 800 megabytes a second moving data from primary storage to a Black Pearl. But we want to be able to further increase that performance and be able to add clustering for reliability as well. So, having failover. So we'll have that on the roadmap as well. Other important components are cloud integration. So we want to be able to move data out of the cloud or out of an S3 or object store, or even move data out of Black Pearl into a different location. We're seeing that a lot, where users are generating data in the cloud, like that is where the data exists initially. But they want to keep it for a long period of time maybe, and so maybe they want to make another copy to local storage or to another cloud, and so we'll be able to do that. And then hand in hand with that would be having StorCycle run in the cloud. We can do that already, because you can spin up a Windows or Linux server in the cloud and you could run StorCycle there. But we want to have a tighter integration with the cloud, and of course being able to support more targets like Google and Azure. In terms of how StorCycle is priced and works, we are primarily structured based on the number of users. So you can see we've got 4 different license levels: administrator, workgroup, data center, and enterprise. The administrator license has 3 users, so up to 3 named users can use the system. That would include administrators and storage managers, basically any user you add to the StorCycle system. With that, you can move an unlimited amount of data to Spectra storage targets. So to Spectra's Black Pearl or Black Pearl NAS systems, it's a tape, object storage disk. You could move petabytes and petabytes with that license. That also includes 25 terabytes of free cloud out, and you can purchase more of that cloud out license the list price is $50 a terabyte for a permanent license, or $15 a terabyte for a subscription license. So we do sell these licenses with a permanent or an annual or subscription-based license. The administrator license starts at, for the permanent license starts at $12,000. For the permanent, or $7,200 for the annual subscription license, and goes up from there. The list price of the enterprise license that gets you everything, unlimited users, unlimited cloud out. The list price for the permanent version of that is $144,000, although we're doing an initial adopters discount of 33%, so I think it brings it down to $96,000 for the initial launch of the product for that top level license. And again, those are also available on a subscription basis as well. We'll also have some different features available in the different licenses as we add new features to the product. Some of them may only be available in the different higher licenses, and you can add them on for a fee on the lower licenses. And so please contact us. You know, obviously we'll send you a follow-up email with the webinar recording, whether you attended live today or not. We encourage you to schedule a demo to see more. You know, I really just scratched the surface of StorCycle. We can show you all the other capabilities of it, including, you know, analytics and reporting, all that good stuff.
Thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to the next time. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.